Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to a world of flickering torchlight and distant bells, where smoke curls through cold morning air and the rhythm of life moves with the turning of the seasons. The ground is damp beneath worn boots. The wind carries the scent of earth and wood smoke, and somewhere in the dark, a church bell marks the passing of another humble day. So, before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe, only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The word medieval tends to conjure a certain image: stone castles glowing in torchlight, knights in shining armor, maybe a princess waiting by a window, which is a nice thought if you ignore the fact that most windows didn't have glass, and most of the people lived in mud huts, so smoky you'd think they were trying to hotbox the Middle Ages. The truth, as usual, was less cinematic and more damp. The medieval world was, in short, a place defined by dirt, literal, spiritual, and economic. The average person, and by that we mean almost everyone, was locked in an endless loop of toil, weather, and superstition. The noble few at the top might have escaped the plough, but they were often trapped by their own kind of misery, stitched together by politics, bad hygiene, and occasionally cousin marriages that would make a modern genealogist break into a cold sweat. If you were alive in, say, the 12th century in northern France or England, you were almost certainly a peasant, and your day revolved around soil, not the romantic sort of hands-in-the-earth soil, but a constant presence that covered your clothes, crept under your nails, and followed you into your house, which was often just more earth rearranged into walls. The typical village was clustered around a manor, a large estate owned by some local lord or churchman, who on paper protected his tenants and in practice mostly collected rent and enforced the rules. It was a system that looked stable from a distance and suffocating up close. Peasants didn't own the land they worked. They were assigned narrow strips, long, thin rows scattered through vast communal fields. It was an early version of forced teamwork, where every farmer's livelihood depended on his neighbors not messing things up. If you wanted to plow, you needed a team of oxen, 8, ideally, and since no single peasant could afford that, you'd share animals with others, tying your success to whoever showed up late that morning. The heavy plow itself was an achievement of technology, but it was still heavy. Imagine dragging a refrigerator through wet clay for hours. That was the workday. Agriculture was organized through a 3-field system, an early attempt at efficiency. 1 field for winter crops, 1 for spring, and 1 left fallow to recover. It kept the soil healthy, which was nice, though the people were rarely so lucky. Crop rotation couldn't save anyone from rain that refused to stop, or frost that killed the seed before it sprouted. A single bad season could mean hunger, and a couple of bad years could mean famine. The Great Famine of 1315 was the worst of these, a stretch of endless rain that drowned crops and livestock alike. People ate their seed grain, then their animals, then things no one should eat. The line between desperation and catastrophe was always thin. For most, the Lord's land came first. You owed him labor, days spent plowing his fields before you touched your own. If he called for extra work during harvest or repairs, you went, because not going meant punishment or fine. You also paid for every basic service: grinding grain at the Lord's mill, baking bread in his oven, or pressing apples in his cider press. These were monopolies in the medieval sense, unchallenged and mandatory. You couldn't just decide to make your own mill unless you also wanted to risk the Lord's anger, which tended to be more immediate than market forces. Home life was a masterpiece of simplicity and smoke. A typical cottage had 1 or 2 rooms, built from wattle and daub, a polite term for sticks covered in mud and animal dung. The roof was thatched, meaning it leaked and occasionally burned down. Inside, the floor was the ground, the furniture was rough wood, and the air was thick with the smell of burning peat, stew, and livestock, since animals were often brought indoors to keep them safe, or more honestly, to keep everyone warm. Ventilation was theoretical. There was a fire in the center and a hole in the roof for the smoke to escape, but it didn't. Instead, it hung low, staining walls and lungs alike. Hygiene was interpretive. Bathing wasn't completely unknown, but it was complicated. Heating water was a lot of work, and people feared that bathing opened the pores to disease. A quick rinse of the hands and face was common, full-body cleanliness less so. Clothes were rarely washed, and lice were inevitable, as were fleas, which happily moved between humans and the rats that carried them. A scratch from one of those fleas might have felt trivial, until the 14th century when a microscopic hitchhiker named Yersinia pestis made it catastrophic. But we'll drift toward that plague-ridden chapter later. The medieval diet was heavy on grain, pottage, a kind of thick porridge made from whatever you could grow or scrounge. It was filling at least, and bland enough to be safe. Meat was a luxury. Chickens were for eggs, cows for milk, and pigs for emergencies. Vegetables came from small garden plots, onions, beans, cabbages, and seasoning was minimal. Salt was expensive, and imported spices were as distant as Mars. When the weather turned cruel, the menu shrank even more. Malnutrition was so common it was almost invisible. Still, amid all the filth and labor, the rhythm of medieval life had its own kind of structure. The church bell dictated time. Its ringing was the medieval version of a clock, and the calendar was a cycle of work and holy days. Sunday was a rest day, at least in theory, and the year was dotted with feast days tied to saints which broke the monotony, even if the food didn't. Religion wasn't just belief, it was architecture, law, and atmosphere. Cathedrals rose like alien spaceships over towns of wood and mud, glowing with stained glass that turned daylight into color. For most people, these were the most beautiful things they'd ever see, a promise that somewhere beyond the mud there was order, purpose, and maybe clean water. But for every sense of divine order, there was superstition. The world was full of invisible dangers. Witches, demons, bad air, the evil eye, and remedies were as creative as they were ineffective. If a fever struck, a doctor might examine your urine by holding it up to the light, or taste it, which is exactly as grim as it sounds. The body, according to Galen and his followers, was ruled by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and sickness came from imbalance. The solution was to drain, purge, or vomit the excess away. Bleeding was the favorite cure, achieved with a knife, a cup, or a leech. A man might go to the doctor for a headache and leave lighter by a pint of blood. For the peasantry, there was little access to such professional torture anyway. Most relied on local healers, midwives, or the occasional monk who knew his way around herbs. Remedies ranged from practical willow bark tea for pain to deeply symbolic wearing charms or saying certain prayers. Miracles were an accepted part of the medical system. If the body failed, the soul might still be patched through faith. Shrines to saints became medieval clinics, places where the desperate sought healing through proximity to sacred bones or a vial of holy water. And if that failed, well, there was always another saint somewhere. Death wasn't distant. It lived next door, slept in the same room, and arrived often. Infant mortality was brutal. Nearly half of children didn't survive to age 10, and childbirth was as dangerous as any battlefield. The average life expectancy hovered in the 30s, though that number hides the survivors who made it to 60. The danger wasn't just famine or infection, but simple accidents. A small cut could fester. A broken bone could mean permanent disability. It was a world where every injury carried a faint hum of mortality. And yet, people didn't move through this life in despair. They married, celebrated, gossiped, and sang. They found joy in the small and the familiar. A warm hearth, a successful harvest, the birth of a child. Their humor was earthy, their songs blunt, and their faith persistent. If they couldn't escape hardship, they could at least joke about it. Medieval literature, what survived of it, proves they weren't humorless. From bawdy tales to sly jokes about priests and lords, their laughter was often aimed upward, which may be the oldest form of quiet rebellion. Higher up the social ladder, life looked cleaner, but often wasn't. Nobles had stone walls instead of mud ones, but drafts still found their way through every gap. A great hall was impressive by candlelight, but it was also smoky, noisy, and occasionally shared with the livestock of visiting guests. The food was richer, more meat, more spice, but not necessarily safer. Spoilage was common, and food poisoning was a recurring surprise. The wealthy had servants, armor, and power, but they were just as mortal and often just as unwashed. Royalty lived within this same system, but with its absurdities magnified. Kings and queens were surrounded by ceremony that could mask decay. Their clothing sparkled, but the court itself was a dense tangle of family politics, financial strain, and medical oddities brought on by generations of intermarriage. The higher the bloodline, the more likely it had circled back on itself. Dynastic marriage was both strategy and trap. It created alliances across Europe, but also ensured that the same handful of families shared not only crowns, but chromosomes. The results ranged from eccentric to tragic. Later dynasties would make the pattern obvious. Jawlines and illnesses passed down like heirlooms. But even in the early Middle Ages, noble families were tight knots of cousins and political necessity. Marriages were less about affection and more about property. Love could happen, though it was considered a dangerous distraction. A good match was one that strengthened borders or appeased rival claimants, not one that made dinner conversation enjoyable. Through all of this, the medieval world moved at a pace we can barely imagine. Slow, seasonal, and stubborn. News traveled on horseback or not at all. A rumor might take weeks to reach the next town, and by then, it would have changed shape entirely. People measured time in planting and harvests, not minutes. Nightfall meant the end of productivity, and winter was an endurance test. The modern idea of free time simply didn't exist. There was time for work, time for prayer, and time to sleep before it all started again. As centuries passed, that rhythm would crack under the weight of famine, plague, and war. The church would struggle to explain suffering that seemed so disproportionate, and the very structure of society, lords above, peasants below, would begin to shift. But before that great unraveling, there was a quieter collapse, one that began with water, rain, and the slow erosion of certainty. The reign of 1315 wasn't dramatic in the cinematic sense. It didn't come as a single apocalyptic storm, the kind that inspires poetry or floods an ark. It was something worse, a steady, endless drizzle that blurred the line between sky and mud. For nearly 2 years, crops drowned where they stood, wheat rotted in the fields, and hay for livestock never dried. The rhythm of life, the sowing, reaping, and storing, fell apart like wet parchment. The people in medieval Europe depended on those rhythms, like lungs, depend on air. There was no industrial backup, no global trade to cushion the blow. The grain from one field fed a village. A failed harvest meant hunger, two meant starvation. Across England, France, and the Low Countries, families began eating seed grain meant for the next season. A short-term rescue that destroyed the future. Livestock was slaughtered prematurely when fodder ran out, and by winter, famine had crept into every corner of the countryside. Chroniclers, who usually preferred to write about kings and miracles, suddenly turned their quills toward misery. They described a grey world of hunger, where travelers died on the roadside, and mothers begged for scrap. Some accounts drifted toward horror, stories of people eating bark, grass, even each other. Modern historians treat the worst tales cautiously, suspecting exaggeration, but even stripped of rumor, the truth is bleak enough. Between 1315 and 1317, Northern Europe lost as much as 15% of its population. The Great Famine, as it's now called, wasn't just a tragedy of weather. It was a demonstration of how fragile the entire medieval order had become. Lords could no longer feed their households. Kings couldn't feed their army. Even the church, which promised divine protection, looked helpless as people starved outside monastery gates. Faith persisted, but cut into crack when priests urged repentance for the sins that caused the rain. The logic rang hollow. For the poorest, survival meant improvisation. Old laws about hunting and foraging were ignored. Peasants snuck into royal forests to trap rabbits or gather nuts, knowing that getting caught might mean mutilation or hanging, but not doing so might mean starvation. Theft surged, so did begging, and so did disease. Weakened bodies invited infection. Dysentery spread through villages with the same relentlessness as the rain. By 1317, when the weather finally shifted, survivors emerged thinner, angrier, and far less convinced that their social betters knew what they were doing. Recovery was uneven. Crops could be replanted, but people couldn't. Families were gone, labor was scarce, and trust was eroded. Lords found their estates empty, and laborers found new leverage. But before this slow reshaping of society could settle, Europe faced a new catastrophe, one that didn't depend on clouds or kings. It would arrive by ship, silent and invisible, carried not by rain, but by fleas. Before the ships, though, came the sickness of faith. The early 14th century had a certain cosmic unease. The weather had turned colder, a sign to many that God was withdrawing warmth in every sense. Astrologers blamed planetary alignments, priests blamed sin, and doctors blamed bad air. Miasma that supposedly drifted from swamps and decaying matter. A handful of thinkers were beginning to study disease empirically, but they had little influence beyond university walls. When famine eased, life didn't return to normal, so much as limp toward it. The fields were replanted, the manors refilled, but the soil still felt heavy. The economy had weakened, and the endless cycle of debt, peasants to lords, lords to the crown, tightened like a belt. Kings, desperate for revenue, taxed more heavily. England's Edward II struggled with rebellions, bad harvests, and an increasingly restless nobility. Across the Channel, France fared little better. A century later, the two kingdoms would fight each other in the 100 Years' War, but already the ground beneath them was soft with unrest. The years after the famine saw one of those subtle, invisible shifts that historians love, the spread of money in place of labor. Before, Peasants owed work, days of ploughing, reaping, or maintaining roads. Now, lords began accepting rent in coin instead. It was simpler and, ironically, gave peasants more freedom. They could sell what little surplus they had at market, pocket the difference, and pay the lord directly. This transition from servile labor to tenant farming was slow, but it marked the beginning of the end for classic feudalism. Still, the average day remained stubbornly medieval. Villages clung to routines, older than their churches. People rose with the light, worked until dusk, and prayed for mercy. The seasons dictated mood. Spring meant optimism. Summer meant exhaustion. Autumn meant anxiety. And winter meant resignation. Illness was constant, but rarely explained. People lived beside animals, ate whatever the harvest allowed, and drank ale instead of water, because water could kill you faster. The ale was weak, barely stronger than juice, but it was safer than the local stream, which doubled as a sewer. Towns were worse. By the early 1300s, cities like London and Paris had swollen far beyond their infrastructure. Narrow streets, overflowing cesspits, and slaughterhouses made the air thick and the ground slick. The Thames, which provided drinking water, also collected everything else: blood, waste, and the occasional unfortunate corpse. To live in a medieval city was to live surrounded by smells you eventually stopped noticing. Royal courts, for all their grandeur, didn't escape the stench. Castles were impressive from afar, but they were cold, smoky, and often damp. Latrines emptied into moats, which might explain why moats were less romantic up close. Nobles decorated their halls with furs and tapestries to block drafts, but the comfort was mostly visual. And while a king's table overflowed with roasted meats and sugared delicacies, it also carried spoiled leftovers, flies, and the occasional rat. Food, paradoxically, could be both abundant and unsafe. Preservation depended on salt, smoke, or vinegar, and any lapse in those could turn dinner into a gamble. The wealthy masked decay with spices imported at ridiculous cost, and the poor simply ate what they had and hoped for the best. The idea of fresh was less about safety and more about timing. Something was fresh if you hadn't eaten it yet. Despite everything, the medieval world was not devoid of charm. It was colorful, literally. Clothing, even among peasants, was dyed with whatever plants or minerals were available. Villages hosted fairs and festivals tied to saints' days, where people danced, drank, and briefly forgot about their debts. Musicians played fiddles, jugglers entertained, and miracle plays reenacted biblical stories with local actors who often slipped in jokes at the expense of priests. For a society that believed life was a temporary test before eternity, people were surprisingly eager to laugh. Yet laughter had limits, and in the mid-14th century, it faltered entirely. The ships arrived. They came to Sicily in 1347, carrying traders from the Black Sea port of Caffa. The sailors were sick, their bodies marked by strange swellings, hard, dark lumps that turned black. The locals pushed the ships away, but it was too late. The rats had already disembarked, and the fleas had already bitten. Within months, the disease spread across the Mediterranean, then north through France and England. No one understood what it was or how it moved, only that it killed quickly and without mercy. The Black Death, as later historians called it, killed tens of millions, maybe half of Europe's population. To contemporaries, it felt like the end of the world. They called it the Great Mortality, the pestilence, God's punishment. Theories spread faster than cure. Some blamed bad air again. Others blamed earthquakes or poisoned wells. The sick were isolated or abandoned, sometimes walled into their houses to die quietly. In cities, the dead outnumbered the living, and burial grounds overflowed. In the countryside, entire villages vanished. But here's the quiet irony of history. Out of this horror came transformation. Labor became precious. Fields stood empty, and lords couldn't force people to return. Survivors demanded wages, and often got them. A century earlier, a peasant who refused to work could be beaten. Now, he could walk to another manor and negotiate. The ruling class responded with panic and new laws. The Statute of Laborers in 1351 tried to cap wages at pre-plague levels, but the genie was out. The social hierarchy, built over centuries, began to tilt. The church, too, wobbled. Priests died in droves caring for the sick, leaving parishes empty. Those who survived were often young or untrained, which eroded authority. When desperate penitents turned to flagellation, public whipping, as a plea for mercy, the church condemned them but couldn't stop the movement. Faith remained, but trust in organized religion cracked again. The plague didn't end cleanly. It lingered in waves for generations, flaring up every few decades. People learned to live with it, much as they lived with hunger, war, and the weather. Life went on, thinner but somehow more self-aware. The survivors had looked death in the face and discovered, rather inconveniently, that the world didn't stop. Some rebuilt, some moved to towns, some inherited land they never expected to own. Others simply kept doing what they always had, plowing, mending, praying. Wait, the mud of the Middle Ages was both literal and metaphorical. It was the substance that clung to everyone, from the humblest farmer to the proudest king. It was what they walked on, built with, and were buried in. And in that mud, the seeds of something modern began to take root, slowly, unevenly, and without anyone noticing at the time. As Europe staggered out of the 14th century, thinner, more cynical, and faintly aware that survival might be its own kind of victory, its nobles found themselves surrounded by an abundance of something they weren't used to. Opportunity. The old order had cracked, just enough for light to slip through. Peasants were suddenly harder to control. Merchants were gaining wealth that didn't come from land, and kings, always allergic to uncertainty, began tightening their grip where they could. In practice, that meant dynastic marriages, endless treaties, and an almost obsessive focus on bloodlines. It wasn't love, it was logistics. The royal families of Europe were like a set of interlocking gears, and every marriage was a calculation in territory, trade, and inheritance. The more closely related two nobles were, the less likely their lands were to end up in hostile hands. Unfortunately, that logic also made the family tree look more like a wreath. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the Habsburgs, the dynasty that would eventually control half of Europe, and through a long sequence of political chess moves and unfortunate genetics, create some of the most distinctive faces in royal portraiture. Their motto, slightly paraphrased, might as well have been, "Let others wage war, you happy Austria, marry." And marry they did, often to their cousins, occasionally to their nieces, and rarely outside the family's own gene pool. By the 16th century, the Habsburg chin had become a recognizable feature, jutting proudly from portraits as if trying to escape the canvas. It wasn't the kind of genetic quirk you'd pay extra for in a painting, but it served as an accidental heraldic device. The so-called Habsburg jaw was a byproduct of generations of close kinship, a physical signature of political strategy taken too far. Their bloodlines weren't just thin, they were repetitive. Consider Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, who ruled in the late 17th century. His ancestry chart, when drawn out, looked less like a tree and more like a lattice. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were also double cousins. The family had essentially been marrying itself for 200 years. Charles inherited not only the crown, but also an unfortunate mixture of genetic disorders. Contemporary reports described him as frail, with developmental delays and frequent illness. He could barely chew due to his jaw deformity, and his health declined steadily until his death at 38. He left no heirs, ending the Spanish branch of the dynasty. That might sound tragic, and it was, but it also reshaped Europe. His death without a successor sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, a polite way of saying that several countries fought very hard to decide who would inherit his empire. Millions died over a problem that might have been prevented by one well-placed marriage outside the family reunion. It's easy to mock the Habsburgs from a distance, but they were hardly unique. The same obsession with blood purity and alliance drove most royal families. It wasn't vanity so much as a rigid belief that noble blood was qualitatively different, almost sacred. Marrying a commoner, no matter how brilliant or healthy, was considered contamination. The result was a long history of dynasties, slowly folding inward, preserved in oil paintings and medical records. And beneath the silk and ceremony, royal life could be surprisingly bleak. For every banquet, there were years of tension, infertility, and paranoia. Producing heirs wasn't a private matter. It was a national project. Queens were expected to bear children frequently, and if they didn't, suspicion fell on them immediately. Fertility was political currency. A successful birth could secure peace. A stillbirth could trigger war. Catherine of Aragon, for instance, endured 6 pregnancies in 9 years, with only one surviving child. Mary, her husband, Henry VIII, wasn't known for patience. Convinced that divine punishment had denied him a son, he sought an annulment, setting off the English Reformation and centuries of religious upheaval. Catherine's story is often framed as a tragedy of love, but it was also one of medical misfortune and the brutal pressure of dynastic duty. In another world, with better obstetric care and a less anxious husband, she might have lived quietly as queen. Instead, she became the first in a long line of discarded wives. Henry's obsession with succession was far from unique. Across Europe, male heirs were the holy grail, the insurance policy for dynasties built on land and lineage. Queens who failed to produce them were pitied or punished. Those who did were celebrated but often didn't survive the experience. Childbirth in royal chambers might have been surrounded by gold and velvet, but it was no less dangerous than in a peasant's cottage. The difference was that more people were watching. The court ritual of childbirth was a strange blend of privacy and spectacle. Witnesses were required to prove legitimacy, sometimes dozens of them, crammed into the room while the queen labored behind a thin curtain. The atmosphere was less miracle of life and more royal audit. Once the baby arrived, the focus shifted to lineage and alliances. Names were chosen for diplomacy as much as sentiment. The child's health was secondary, at least in the public record. For the children who survived, life was a mixture of privilege and confinement. Royal childhoods were carefully managed, strict tutors, arranged friendships, and almost no freedom. They were raised less as people than as symbols, pieces in the family's long-term strategy. Many grew up isolated, sometimes frightened, and often profoundly lonely. It's one of history's quieter ironies that the most powerful children in Europe were also some of the least. The pattern repeated itself across centuries. its rhythm as predictable as the toll of a church bell. A royal child would grow into a monarch or marry one, surrounded by courtiers who smiled too much and relatives who doubled as rivals. They'd live in castles designed more for defense than comfort, where drafts slipped through cracks in the stone and tapestries served as insulation. They'd dine on feasts too rich for human digestion, endure medical treatments worse than their illnesses, and listen to physicians debate whether illness came from bad air, bad blood, or bad humors. Royal physicians, incidentally, were some of the busiest men in Europe. Their job wasn't so much to heal as to maintain the illusion of control. A king who fell ill threatened the entire political ecosystem. Treatments were elaborate rituals, cupping, bleeding, purging, performed with solemn confidence. It didn't matter that most of them did more harm than good. The point was to look decisive. Take the French court in the 17th century, where doctors might prescribe bleeding twice a day for fever, followed by emetics to clear the stomach, and finally a diet of broth and prayer. When Louis XIV underwent surgery for an anal fistula, a procedure performed without anesthesia, his successful recovery became a national event. The doctor was rewarded with titles, and the surgery was commemorated with music. The entire episode was proof that even royal suffering could be turned into propaganda for all their titles and jewels. Many royals lived short, miserable lives, counters syphilis, smallpox, and tuberculosis haunted palaces as thoroughly as they did slums. The difference was that nobles could afford doctors to make things worse. They also tended to die surrounded by more ceremony, priests, courtiers, and scribes recording the exact time of their last breath, as if precision could add dignity. When death came, the body became a political object. Funerals were choreographed displays of continuity, reminding everyone that the crown never really died, even if its wearer did. The corpse might be embalmed, divided, or displayed, depending on local custom. Louis XIV's body, for example, was boiled to separate the flesh from the bones before transport. It was practical in a grim way, and considered respectful. Behind the solemn processions and painted portraits, there was a quiet thread of absurdity. Dynastic continuity required constant vigilance, yet it was endlessly undermined by the very strategies meant to preserve it. Marry a cousin to keep the crown safe, and risk a sickly heir, centralize power to prevent rebellion, and alienate the nobles needed to enforce it. Royalty, for all its splendor, was a delicate balancing act on a foundation of superstition and questionable medical advice. And while the peasants tilled their muddy fields and the merchants counted their coins, the royals nursed their own peculiar anxieties, the kind that came not from hunger or exposure, but from isolation, inbreeding, and the pressure of maintaining an illusion. As the 15th century drifted toward the 16th, those illusions began to shimmer, cracking just enough for something new to flicker through. Reason, reform, and a slow awakening that even kings could not fully contain. By the dawn of the 16th century, Europe's noble classes had begun a quiet but noticeable transformation. After centuries of surviving plague, famine, and one another, the great families of Europe now discovered the art of being visibly magnificent. If the medieval world had prized endurance, the Renaissance celebrated presentation. Silk replaced homespun, marble replaced mud, and royal bodies themselves became symbols painted, perfumed, and displayed like divine artifacts. Of course, behind the velvets and oil portraits, the human body remained stubbornly mortal. Kings and queens were not immune to disease or deformity. They simply had better lighting. But now, there was a new expectation. that a ruler should look like one, the late medieval monarch, might be judged by piety or conquest, but his Renaissance descendant was evaluated by symmetry, posture, and the ability to stand still for long stretches while someone painted him wearing 40 pounds of brocade. The royal face, in particular, carried weight. It was not merely personal. It was dynastic branding. Every curve of a jaw, every droop of an eyelid was recorded and reinterpreted as destiny. The Tudor court in England understood this perfectly. Henry VIII, before he grew wide enough to qualify as his own border, was famously athletic and handsome, a living symbol of strength after the Wars of the Roses. His appearance reassured a weary nation that the Tudors were divinely favored and that peace, at least temporarily, had returned. But the body that symbolized stability also became a public battleground. Henry's health began to fail in midlife, partly from injuries, partly from excess. His leg ulcer, an oozing chronic wound, likely caused by a jousting accident, made him increasingly irritable and immobile. Physicians treated it, as they treated most things, with incisions, poultices, and prayers. Nothing helped. The smell alone reportedly emptied rooms. His temper, once fiery, turned volcanic. It's tempting to imagine that the infamous executions and marital chaos of his later years were political, but much of it may have been fueled by pain, infection, and the slow realization that the invincible young king was rotting alive. Henry's daughters inherited his contradictions. Mary the Faith was devout, anxious, and physically frail, shaped by her mother's years of stress and her father's rejection. Elizabeth I, by contrast, learned early that her survival depended on performance. She turned the concept of the royal body into a political masterpiece. Every detail, her powdered skin, her flame-red wigs, her carefully staged speeches, was designed to project control. Even her virginity became state policy, transforming private circumstance into public myth. She cultivated the image of the Virgin Queen, wedded not to a man, but to England itself, which solved the inconvenient issue of succession by turning it into propaganda. Her portraits exaggerated the effect. Painters elongated her neck, smoothed her skin, and surrounded her with celestial imagery. The result was not realism, but iconography. Elizabeth wasn't just a ruler. She was an aesthetic, a human emblem of divine order. It was an ingenious move in a world that still half believed in magic. If you couldn't live forever, you could at least appear timeless. Across the Channel, the French court was refining a similar philosophy, with more perfume and less restraint. The Valois kings turned elegance into politics. Francis I, an energetic patron of art and architecture, imported Italian artists, including Leonardo da Vinci, who spent his final years painting and sketching in France. Under Francis, the French court became a laboratory of taste, where etiquette was not just manners but strategy. A well-timed bow could be as powerful as a sword. This obsession with appearance had its costs. Royal women, in particular, bore the brunt of it. Their bodies were canvases for fashion trends that occasionally bordered on physical punishment. Corsets stiffened with whalebone compressed the torso into shapes that nature had not approved. Farthingales extended skirts into improbable geometries. Cosmetics, usually lead-based, created the illusion of purity while slowly poisoning their wearers. Elizabeth I's signature pale complexion, for example, came from Venetian ceruse, a mix of white lead and vinegar. It hid smallpox scars and projected the ethereal pallor associated with nobility, but it also caused skin damage, tooth decay, and potentially neurological symptoms. The irony of achieving eternal beauty by accelerating death did not go unnoticed, though no one stopped using it. Appearances, after all, were not optional. Male rulers had their own aesthetic expectations. A monarch's wardrobe was an accounting system in silk. Henry VIII's closets were legendary, filled with garments embroidered in gold and studded with jewels. Louis IV would later elevate this into theatre, dressing himself each morning in a ceremony called the lever, attended by nobles who watched him put on stockings with reverent awe. Clothing was hierarchy, in visible form. Whoever held the garter, literally or metaphorically, was close to power, and yet beneath these layers of finery, bodies continued to betray their owners. The Renaissance may have rediscovered anatomy, but it did little for medicine. Physicians still clung to the four humors, bleeding and purging their patients with conviction. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or much understanding. Dental care amounted to extraction by force. Even at the height of luxury, toothache remained a universal leveler. In some ways, this was the era's most poetic contradiction. The same kings who commissioned cathedrals and funded voyages across oceans could still be undone by an abscessed molar. The same queens who ruled nations through diplomacy and ceremony could be felled by childbirth or infection. The fragility of the royal body was an open secret, masked by etiquette and portraiture. The ritual of death reflected this tension perfectly. When a monarch died, the process of dying was public theatre. Physicians documented each symptom, courtiers whispered prayers, and priests hovered like administrative assistants of the afterlife. The deathbed was both sacred and bureaucratic. Once the final breath was taken, the royal roast became a logistical project, embalmed, dressed, displayed, and transported with elaborate ceremony. Even decomposition was political. Funerary masks were cast to preserve a ruler's face, but they rarely captured causality, only the solemn finality of wax and plaster. Some monarchs, like France's Louis XIII, were dissected as part of religious ritual, their hearts buried separately in ornate reliquaries. Others, like England's Charles I, received quiet burials after noisy downfalls. The message was always the same: the king is dead, long live the king. The body could rot, but the system must endure. Royal art reinforced this illusion of permanence. Portraits of dead rulers continued to hang in halls and chambers, their painted gazes unblinking, their flesh frozen in youth. They became part of the architecture, reminders that monarchy was less about individuals than continuity. The same families that buried their children young and bled their elders into weakness could still produce paintings that suggested eternity. The paradox extended into faith. Monarchs claimed divine right, the belief that their authority came directly from God, but they also needed earthly approval. Church and crown performed a careful dance of mutual legitimacy. The coronation ritual captured it best. Anointing with holy oil transformed an ordinary human into something quasi-sacred. It was a powerful illusion, reinforced by centuries of ceremony, and everyone agreed not to look too closely at the practical details, like the cough, limp, or rash that might accompany the anointing. By the 17th century, this choreography reached its peak. In France, Louis XIV, the Sun King, turned monarchy itself into performance art. He rose, dined, and slept on schedule, surrounded by an audience of courtiers whose proximity to him defined their importance. Every gesture, every glance was deliberate. Versailles, his vast palace outside Paris, became the theatre of his divinity, its hall of mirrors reflecting his image endlessly, as though repetition could equal immortality. But immortality as always, was fragile, beneath the powdered wigs and perfumed corridors. Epidemics still swept through Europe. Smallpox scarred faces and emptied nurseries. Syphilis spreading quietly through the upper classes. Disfigured bodies that had once embodied grace. Medicine improved slowly, dragged forward by anatomy lessons and trial and error. Yet the royal body remained a paradox, worshipped, painted, and embalmed, but always, inevitably human. The Enlightenment would challenge that sacred image, peeling away the layers of divine mystique. But even before reason lit its lamps, the cracks were visible. Monarchs grew more extravagant to hide their vulnerabilities, more ceremonial to conceal the chaos beneath. The pageantry glowed brighter, precisely because it was hollowing from within. And so, as we drift toward that age of light and revolution, we might pause to appreciate the quiet absurdity of it all. The kings who claimed divinity yet limped with gout. The queens who ruled empires while slowly being poisoned by their own cosmetics. And the courtiers who spent their lives chasing favor from people barely holding themselves together. It was elegance built on exhaustion, a theater of power played out on a stage of flesh. As the 17th century drifted into the 18th, Europe began to look at itself with new, skeptical eyes. Philosophers were asking questions that no one at court particularly wanted answered. Questions about reason, equality, and whether kings were perhaps just well-dressed men with better luck. It was the Enlightenment, an age that claimed to chase light, but still stumbled through a fog of incense and perfume. The divine right of kings, once the unshakable pillar of power, began to sound more like an old superstition recited out of habit. Monarchs tried to adapt. They commissioned portraits in which they appeared less godlike and more enlightened. Holding books instead of scepters, wearing modest silk instead of solid gold. They founded academies, built libraries, and sponsored scientific expeditions, all while continuing to tax peasants to pay for their wars and wardrobes. It was progress, but with footnote. In France, Louis XIV's carefully staged immortality didn't survive him. His successors inherited the palace at Versailles, but not the charisma to fill it. Louis XV, who came to the throne as a child, grew into a man perpetually bored by the rituals designed to glorify him. He had mistresses, hunting dogs, and an unshakable belief that the future would sort itself out. For a while it did. The economy limped, the peasants endured, and the nobles continued their eternal competition for royal attention. But under the powdered surface, resentment fermented. The Enlightenment whispered dangerous things, that authority might come from the governed, that wealth could be earned rather than inherited. Human reason might outrank divine decree. In coffee houses and salons, intellectuals dissected monarchy with the same enthusiasm once reserved for saints' relics. It was all very polite, until the ideas escaped the page. Meanwhile, the royal body remained under surveillance, though now in a more medical sense. The 18th century was obsessed with health, hygiene, and lineage. Physicians still knew little, but they had learned how to sound confident. The court doctor became part scientist, part showman. He measured pulses, prescribed mineral waters, and occasionally bled his patients just to maintain tradition. The illusion of progress was soothing. Royal families continued their tangled web of marriages, and the genetic consequences were quietly accumulating. Hemophilia, the so-called royal disease, would later travel through Europe's crowned heads like an unwanted heirloom, traced most famously to Queen Victoria. But even before that, deformities, miscarriages, and infant deaths haunted nearly every dynasty. The Enlightenment had little to say about recessive genes. By the late 1700s, the tension between grandeur and decay had become almost theatrical. The French court, under Louis the Sixth and Marie Antoinette, was a perfect example: lavish, self-absorbed, and entirely unaware of the mood outside its gardens. Versailles was still magnificent, its mirrors still gleaming, but its inhabitants were performing a play for an audience that had stopped clapping. Marie Antoinette, often treated by history as a caricature, was in many ways a symptom of the system's exhaustion. She was young, foreign, and expected to symbolize everything France believed about itself. When the people starved, her extravagance became legend. "Let them eat cake," she supposedly said, though she almost certainly didn't. The phrase stuck because it felt true in spirit, an emblem of how far the monarchy had drifted from reality. Her world was one of impossible appearances. Fashion had become an arms race, towering wigs, ships balanced on coiffures, cosmetics layered like plaster. The queen's dresses required servants to carry them, her mornings filled with rituals of dressing and undressing that resembled a religious ceremony conducted in silk. Each act of beauty was a small defiance against mortality, though by then mortality was marching toward the palace gates. The Enlightenment's promise of reason eventually met the mob's promise of action. When revolution erupted in 1789, it wasn't simply a collapse, it was a correction. Centuries of ceremony were replaced by a single sharp blade. The guillotine, a device invented in the name of equality, gave every head the same treatment: king, queen, or commoner. Louis XVI, who had once been anointed with holy oil, was now reduced to a public anatomy lesson. The spectacle was meant to erase superstition, but it only created new myths. The French Revolution was as much theatre as monarchy had been, just with different costumes. The idea of the royal body lingered even in its destruction. Crowds stared not because they believed in divine rights, but because they couldn't quite believe the opposite, that a man once worshipped could bleed like anyone else. Across Europe, other monarchs watched in horror and fascination. Some reformed, at least on paper. Others tightened control. Catherine the Great of Russia flirted with Enlightenment ideals, inviting philosophers to her court, then crushed revolts with impeccable efficiency. Frederick the Great of Prussia claimed to be the first servant of the state, though his servants still bowed very low. Even reform had its hierarchy. The Age of Reason didn't abolish monarchy, it merely repackaged it. Crowns remained, but their halos dimmed. Kings became constitutional, parliaments grew louder, and the divine began to retreat from politics. The royal body, once sacred, became decorative. Portraits softened. Monarchs smiled awkwardly, posing with dogs or children instead of thrones. They were learning the art of seeming human, a skill that would become essential in the centuries ahead. Yet, the contradictions persisted. Royal lives were still shaped by duty, isolation, and spectacle. The bloodlines remained tangled, the expectations unchanged. Marriages were arranged for diplomacy, not affection. Children were raised as state investments. The Enlightenment might have illuminated the world, but royal households continued to live by candlelight, gold-plated and drafty, flickering at the edges. Meanwhile, ordinary people were changing faster than their rulers. The Industrial Revolution was beginning to stir, dragging Europe into a new rhythm of factories and machines. The old feudal order, already hollowed out by centuries of famine and plague, was finally collapsing under the weight of modernity. But the royals, those reluctant survivors of medieval hierarchy, clung to their rituals like heirloom. The 19th century would test how long they could last. Empires would stretch across continents. Monarchs would ride trains and pose for photographs, their images mass-produced for the first time. They would learn the unsettling truth that fame, once divine, could now be printed on postcards. Their bodies, so long the property of myth, were becoming public commodities. But that, of course, is where the next part drifts in. The candles are still burning, the wigs are powdered, and somewhere in a palace drawing room, a royal family is smiling for the first camera, unaware that it will preserve their faces far longer than their thrones. By the 19th century, the old world had become self-conscious. Kings and queens, once painted in gold leaf, were now photographed in stiff collars and awkward poses, looking faintly startled by their own visibility. Cameras had democratized the gaze. No longer could monarchs control every image. Their portraits could be bought, traded, even mocked. A face that once symbolized divine order might now appear mass-produced on a tin box of biscuits. The royal body, still ceremonial, still expected to represent something larger than life, was quietly losing its mystery. Victoria of the United Kingdom, crowned in 1838, ruled an empire where the sun famously never set and the gossip never stopped. She was both a symbol of stability and a surprisingly human presence. Her long mourning for Prince Albert turned grief into national identity. For 40 years she dressed in black, transforming private sorrow into public virtue. People admired her devotion, others found it oppressive, the visual embodiment of an empire both vast and melancholy. The royal disease, hemophilia, crept through her descendants like an invisible thread, reminding everyone that even the most powerful bloodlines could bleed too easily. Her son Leopold inherited it and died young. Through her daughters, the condition spread across Europe, most fatefully to Russia, where her granddaughter Alexandra married Tsar Nicholas II. Their only son, Alexei, was born with the same disorder. The boy's frailty became the empire's secret weakness, a hidden illness that shaped politics as much as genetics. Enter Rasputin, the Siberian mystic, whose presence at the Russian court would become legend and scandal. He claimed to heal the Tsarevich through prayer and hypnosis, and for a time he seemed to succeed. Modern historians suspect he may have simply stopped the doctors from using blood-thinning treatments. But whatever the reason, Alexandra's faith in him became absolute. To the outside world, it looked like madness, a peasant holy man whispering into the ears of royalty, while the empire crumbled outside their palace walls. The whispers of impropriety were exaggerated, but the damage was real. By the time revolution came in 1917, the Romanovs were symbols of everything outdated and untouchable. When they were executed the following year in a basement in Yekaterinburg, it was not just a political act, but a symbolic one. The idea of monarchy itself, of sacred blood, divine right, and dynastic destiny was being buried. The bullets were final, but the concept had been dying for centuries. Elsewhere, monarchies adapted rather than vanished. Britain survived by softening. Victoria's descendants learned the delicate art of appearing ordinary while living in palaces. The 20th century demanded a new performance. Humility. George V, who reigned during World War I, understood that royal survival depended on rebranding. In 1917, he changed the family name from the Germanic Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the more patriotic Windsor. It was cosmetic, but effective. The royal family became a national mascot rather than a ruling class. Other dynasties were less agile. The Habsburgs, whose family tree had once encompassed half of Europe, were now relics of a lost empire. Their collapse at the end of World War I marked the true twilight of hereditary monarchy in Central Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, that intricate patchwork of languages and loyalties, dissolved under the weight of modern nationalism. The once mighty Habsburg name was reduced to footnotes and awkwardly long genealogies, even as thrones disappeared. Fascination with royal lives deepened. Newspapers and early tabloids discovered that people would pay handsomely to read about the private habits of people they would never meet. The royal body, stripped of divine aura, became entertainment. Every illness, affair, or awkward photograph was public property. In some sense, monarchy survived by becoming celebrity culture before celebrity culture existed. Victoria's great-great-grandson Edward VIII would later embody that transition. His abdication in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American, was scandalous enough to shock an empire. For centuries, royal marriages had been instruments of policy. Now they were headline romance. The spectacle was irresistible. The abdication speech, broadcast on radio, made the private voice of a king public for the first time. Listeners heard not a ruler, but a man torn between love and duty, and they believed it. Monarchy, newly humanized, became a soap opera in Aming. Meanwhile, the modern age moved faster than crowns could keep up. World wars flattened empires, and democracy replaced dynastic rule with ballots and bureaucracy. Yet the appeal of royalty lingered, perhaps because it offered continuity in a world that refused to sit still. People might overthrow monarchs in theory, but in practice, they still turned out for weddings and funerals, still stood in the rain to watch a gilded carriage roll by. The symbolism was stubbornly comforting. By the mid-20th century, television turned the royal family into a permanent broadcast. Elizabeth II, crowned in 1953, was perhaps the first truly modern monarch, part relic, part celebrity, part national therapist. Her face appeared on coins, stamps, and television screens across continents. She smiled, waved, and rarely spoke her mind. The art of silence became royal policy. Her long reign, stretching into the 21st century, turned constancy into its own kind of power. Yet even as she mastered that role, the contradictions deepened. Modern royals were expected to be relatable yet perfect, visible yet dignified, traditional yet modern. Their lives became a balancing act, performed under relentless scrutiny when tragedy struck. Divorces, scandals, untimely deaths. The world consumed the grief as entertainment. The medieval fascination with the royal body, once religious, had simply evolved into mass media. It's tempting to say that the monarchy's story is one of decline, but perhaps it's more like adaptation through irony, from divine embodiment to constitutional mascot, from holy relic to tabloid subject. The royal body has always mirrored whatever the age needed to believe. In the Middle Ages, people needed a link to God. In the Enlightenment, a symbol of refinement. In the modern world, a mirror of continuity. Kings and queens survived, not by being powerful, but by being symbolic, visible enough to remind people that history still had a pulse. And so the tale circles back, as history often does. The peasants who once bowed to their lords now watch documentaries about them. The castles that once reeked of smoke and sewage now glow under museum lighting. The same crowns that once justified wars now glitter harmlessly behind glass. The mud, the plague, the dynastic fevers, they've all faded into nostalgia, polished by time, until even tragedy looks picturesque. But if you listen closely, beneath the whisper of silk, the rustle of newspaper pages, the hum of televised ceremonies. You can still hear it, the steady rhythm that began 1,000 years ago, when a bell marked the workday and survival meant bowing to someone slightly cleaner than you. The names have changed, the rituals have softened, but the impulse remains. Humans still crave hierarchy, story, and spectacle. So when you see a modern monarch waving from a balcony framed by cameras and history, remember that behind the diamonds and polite smiles lies the same fragile anatomy as the peasants who once tilled their fields, the same hunger for meaning, the same fear of decay. The divine right may have vanished, but the fascination endures, quiet, irrational, and somehow comforting. And perhaps that's the real brutal truth of medieval life, and of every age since, that civilization is mostly costume, and beneath the costume, we remain stubbornly human.